For more than 2,000 years, people have been concerned with the question, what kind of society would be the best to live in? Among the many very famous thinkers who have addressed themselves to this important question are the following: Plato, Thomas More, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, Karl Marx, and most recently in the 1940s, psychologist B.F. Skinner. The most famous book written on this subject of utopia is Plato's Republic. Plato is regarded by many as having been the greatest of the great philosophers. Why so? Did he express more truths than other philosophers? No. The reason that Plato is considered to be such a great philosopher is that he raised many important questions, and in his writings offers many thought-provoking comments and analysis of so many aspects of daily living. This program is the second in a series I'm doing on Plato's most famous book, again entitled The Republic. Allow me a brief review of some important biographical information concerning Plato. The Republic was written in 380 BC, approximately 400 years before Christ. Plato was born in ancient Athens in Greece. He was a student of Socrates, and Plato founded what is generally considered to be the first university in the Western world. It was called the Academy. Plato's writing style generally consists of dialogues. He usually has two people speaking, one of whom very often is his teacher, Socrates. In fact, scholars often refer to the Platonic Socrates, the idea being that when Socrates talks in a Platonic dialogue, we can't be sure whether Socrates is expressing his own ideas or those of Plato, although scholars do believe that on many important issues their thinking was quite similar. The Republic is considered to be Plato's masterpiece, and not only is it considered to be a great work in philosophy, it's considered also to be great literature. Some of the important questions raised by Plato in the Republic are the following. First of all, what's the best kind of government? It may surprise you to find out that Plato did not believe that democracy was the best kind of government. Also, what kind of social economic system would be the best? Plato believed that both wealthy and poor people pose a danger to society, and therefore Plato in his utopia, Plato in his ideal society, wanted to eliminate wealth and poverty. I'll be talking about this a little more in a little bit. Also, another question that Plato raises is, what's the best way to educate people? And what should be the goals of education if society is to flourish? And also, Plato has some interesting segments on religion and what should be the role of religion in a good society. And Plato raises this question: can a nation be strong and prosperous if its people do not believe in God? And finally, Plato has some very interesting comments about what the status of the media and the arts would be in his utopia. One of the questions Plato raises is this: should the government ever do anything to ensure that literature and music and the media have a positive influence on people? In my last segment, I did talk about Plato's concept of the ideal government and also his ideas concerning the best social economic system. So let me just provide a very brief review of some of the comments I made concerning those issues. With regard to government, Plato, as I said, did not believe in democracy. His government would be a government of philosopher kings. It would be ruled, in other words, his society would be ruled by a group of people, all of whom had studied philosophy. Plato believed that if one is to govern wisely, one must have a good background in philosophy. Indeed, Plato says this in the Republic, and I'm quoting him: "Utopia would not come into being until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the power and spirit of philosophy." And what is philosophy? Well, a philosopher is a lover of wisdom, and one who has wisdom is one who has insight and good sense and a good handle on the nature of reality, on the way things really are. Plato, in other words, wanted political power and wisdom combined in the same people. Again, Plato wanted political power and wisdom combined in the same people. And he believed that a society ruled by philosophic kings would fulfill that dictum. And what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of having philosophic kings? Well, I mentioned in the last program that among the advantages, perhaps, might be that Plato's rulers are better trained to govern than perhaps rulers in the typical society. But of course, there are some glaring disadvantages of having philosophic kings. And perhaps the most glaring disadvantage is that Plato provides no system of checks and balances. What's to prevent these philosophic kings from becoming fascists? And what is Plato's criticism of democracy? Why is it he doesn't want democracy? Well, Plato believed that democracy generally results in an excess of liberty, and he believes that's what will kill democracy, and the excess of liberty will eventually result in tyranny. With regard to Plato's socioeconomic system, I mentioned that Plato did not want rich people nor poor people in his society. He criticized wealth in this way. He said that wealth is the parent of luxury and laziness, and he said that poverty is the parent of meanness and viciousness, and that both wealth and poverty are parents of discontent. Well, what might be an advantage of having no rich or poor people in society? Well, a possible advantage would be if there are no poor people, perhaps there will be less crime. And what might be an advantage, or excuse me, a disadvantage of having neither wealthy nor poor people in a society? Well, a possible disadvantage is that there might be less incentive for people to work hard if they know that they'll not be allowed to accumulate a lot of money. Another question raised by Plato is this: should the government ever take any action to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor? Again, should the government ever take any action to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor? Let's look at both sides of the issue. Some people would argue no, the government should never do this, that it's unjust for the government to take money from people who have earned that money, or to take property from people who have earned that property. Also, others contend that if the government engages in narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor, this also can reduce the incentive of people to work hard. And what are the arguments on the other side? What are the arguments of proponents of the government actively engaging in trying to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor? Well, some people argue it's justice. They argue that no child should grow up in poverty when there are people in society who have more money than they can spend. Also, these people argue that the great religions teach that we are our brother's keepers. Jesus, for example, in Luke 12, says this: "From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required." And Hillel, the famous Jewish sage, said this: "If I am not for me, who will be? But if I am for me only, what am I?" And Andrew Carnegie, very famous industrialist and wealthy man of late 19th century America and early 20th century America, said this, and this may surprise you, Again, this is from Andrew Carnegie's essay on wealth, written in the 1890s. Carnegie said, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced. The man who dies rich dies disgraced." And we do know that Andrew Carnegie, by the time he died in 1919, had given away approximately 95% of his fortune. Another question that Plato's Republic raises is this: how might lack of economic security affect people? How might lack of economic security affect people? And one of the great philosophers who attempted to answer this question was Bertrand Russell. Russell believed that all people have a haunting fear in the back of their minds. It's a fear of going broke. And Russell contended that this fear is especially strong in people who have children, especially in men who are the breadwinners for their families. Then again, lurking in the back of their minds is the idea they could lose their jobs, lose their money, and what will happen to their family. Russell says, as a consequence of this fear of insecurity, which many people have, people often treat each other unkindly, even cruelly. And Russell said, if one wants to have a more wholesome society, if one wants to establish a society where people treat each other kindly and are less disposed to be cruel towards each other, Russell said it's incumbent on that society to try to afford people a certain amount of economic security. Again, Russell, a proponent of the government trying to provide people with economic security. Russell said this, and I'm quoting him: "Therefore, everything that increases the general security is likely to diminish cruelty." Again, everything that increases the general security is likely to diminish cruelty. What do you think? Plato also addresses himself to the question of the relationship between money and virtue. You know, so many of the religions, the great religions of the world, have addressed themselves to the subject of the connection between money and virtue. And Plato, at least by implication, raises this question: do rich people tend to be more moral, less moral, or no difference in morality compared to other people? And here's what the Platonic Socrates says in the Republic. Again, when I use that expression, the Platonic Socrates, I'm talking about Plato's Socrates and the words he puts in Socrates' mouth in his book. Well, the Platonic Socrates says there is an inverse relationship between virtue and riches. Again, there is an inverse relationship between virtue and riches. Let me give you Socrates' own words, or the words that Plato puts in Socrates' mouth. "The rich push ahead with their money-making, and the more they value money, the less they value virtue. In truth, we may imagine riches and virtues as always balanced in scales against each other." Again, in truth, we may imagine riches and virtues as always balanced in scales against each other. And what have other famous thinkers said about this? Have other famous thinkers agreed with Plato and Socrates that there is an inverse relationship, usually, between wealth and virtue? Well, the great thinkers disagree on this. Let's look at thinkers on both sides. Gandhi agreed with Plato. Gandhi, as you might recall, before adopting a life of voluntary poverty in his 40s, had been a very rich lawyer in South Africa. And Gandhi said this about the rich people he knew, and I'm quoting Gandhi: "I observed almost invariably that the greater the possession of riches, the greater was their moral depravity." Again, the greater the possession of riches, the greater was their moral depravity. Gandhi, in his autobiography, says this: "How heavy is the toll of sins and wrongs that wealth, power, and prestige exact from man." Again, this is Gandhi in his autobiography. How heavy is the toll of sins and wrongs that wealth, power, and prestige exact from man. I must tell you that there have been many people, many famous thinkers, who have disagreed with both Plato and Gandhi. For example, in the late 19th century in the United States and Western Europe, a philosophy known as social Darwinism became somewhat popular. And the social Darwinists taught that wealth is often the result of genetic or biological superiority. Again, the social Darwinists taught that wealth is often the result of genetic or biological superiority. Also, in the United States in the 19th century, some Protestant churches and very famous Protestant ministers advanced the idea that wealth was often the result of virtue, that wealth often came to very good people, and that it's usually the virtuous who become rich. Let me give you an example of such a minister and his comment. The Episcopal Bishop of Massachusetts, writing in 1892, said this, and I'm quoting him: "In the long run, it is only to the man of morality that wealth comes. Occasionally the wicked prosper, but only occasionally. Godliness is in league with riches. Godliness is in league with riches." What do you think? Is it fair to say that the most important characteristics that wealthy people usually have are the following: they work hard, and they're very decent, just people? What do you think? Remember, Plato wants to create a society which encourages kindness and justice. And Plato sounds like Buddha and Jesus in talking about the dangers of people in society admiring rich people. Plato's Socrates says this, and I'm quoting him: "When riches are honored in a city, virtue and good people are less honored than the rich." Again, when riches are honored in a city, virtue and good people are less honored than the rich. And Plato's Socrates goes on to say the following: "Now what is honored anywhere is practiced, and what is dishonored is neglected." This raises an important question concerning American culture. Does American society honor virtue more than wealth? Does the popularity of Donald Trump's program, The Apprentice, say anything significant about America? What do you think? Some other questions that this raises concerning our country. What percentage of Americans would prefer meeting a whistleblower than a movie star or sports celebrity or even Donald Trump? Also, how come we have an Academy Awards program in the United States which honors actors and actresses and movie directors and producers, but we have no such awards program for whistleblowers and for other people who do remarkable work in the United States in trying to alleviate suffering? And also, how come our presidents, both Democrat and Republican, never honor corporate whistleblowers with the Medal of Honor? Again, why is it our presidents never honor corporate whistleblowers with the Medal of Honor? Let me move to another issue that Plato talks about in providing his version of utopia. Thus far, I've talked about his idea of the ideal government, one of philosopher kings, and his ideal, or his idea, I should say, of the ideal socioeconomic system, one which would eliminate rich and poor people, or I should say, would eliminate wealth and poverty. Let me now go on to Plato's version of what education would be like in the ideal society. Plato believed the two most important subjects that all students should study and learn about are gymnastics, and by gymnastics he meant physical education, and music, and by music he meant the humanities. In other words, Plato believed that all students should engage in physical education, and all students should learn subjects in the humanities, philosophy, history, literature. Plato also said that it's quite dangerous to provide one kind of education without the other. In other words, it's quite dangerous to have students engage in learning physical education, but not in studying the humanities. And it's equally dangerous to have students study the humanities, but not engage in physical education. And Plato explains what the dangers are. He says that if one is exclusively devoted to physical education, that this might produce a hard, insensitive, ferocious person. By the same token, Plato says that if one is exclusively devoted to studying the humanities with no regard for physical education, that could produce a soft, effeminate individual who is not prepared to deal with the adversities of everyday living. Let me give you Plato's own words on this. Plato said this, and I'm quoting him: "Did you never observe the effect on the mind itself of exclusive devotion to gymnastic, meaning physical education, or the opposite effect of an exclusive devotion to studying the humanities? In what way shown?" he said, meaning the person he was talking to. Well, Socrates responds, "The one producing a temper of hardness and ferocity, the other of softness and effeminacy." Socrates goes on to say that the mere athlete may be too much of a savage, and the mere academic student too soft. Again, Plato's own words. I should say the Platonic Socrates' own words. The mere athlete becomes too much of a savage, and the mere academic student is melted and softened beyond what is good for him. In other words, Plato is saying that the ideal education involves educating both the body and the mind. And by the way, I must add that Plato's ideal education would also be offered to girls and women, that there would be no difference in Plato's utopia in the way in which boys and girls, men and women were educated. Plato also stimulates our thinking about what the goals of true education might be. Plato believed the goals of education should be to civilize and humanize people, and also to promote mental health in people. Plato believed it was very important that people acquire self-discipline. He believed that contributed to mental health, and therefore in Plato's utopia, a serious effort would be made in the schools to help students cultivate self-discipline. What is Plato's view of human nature? Well, Plato's view of human nature is similar in many ways to that of Christianity and Freud. Plato had a rather dark view of human nature. In fact, Plato said this, and I'm quoting him: "There is much imbalance in all men. There is much imbalance in all men." Plato, like the Christians, like Freud, like other religions and philosophers, taught that it's very important that we all aim for self-conquest, that we all aim to conquer what is bad in ourselves, that we all aim to become less aggressive and less selfish and less greedy and less ignorant. And what was Plato's view of human life? Well, Plato believed that human life is difficult, and therefore, since life is difficult, education must help young people prepare for the adversities which they will inevitably confront in daily living. Do you agree with Plato's possible consequences of just educating the mind or just educating the body? Again, as you recall, he believed that if one just educates the body, that's likely to result in an insensitive, harsh person, and that if one just educates the mind, that's likely to result in a person who's too soft, too effeminate to deal with life's difficulties. Again, Plato stimulates our thinking about the goals of education, and I think the best summary I ever read of what might be the best goals of education is the following: that education should produce honorable thinking people. Education should produce honorable thinking people. Thinking people in the sense of people being able to think critically about propaganda, about advertising propaganda and political propaganda. And also, education, besides producing honorable thinking people, should produce people who have good mental health. A.S. Neal, famous educator, said this: "I'd rather see a school produce a healthy street cleaner than a neurotic scholar." In my next program on Plato's Republic, I'll be focusing in on his ideas concerning religion and the role of religion in society. As Thoreau remarked in Walden, "We are all artists. To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."